Welcome everybody to Fab 5 Productions. In this video, 5 students in the master's degree in World War II Studies program at Arizona State University will present a discussion of the Soviet-Japanese War toward the end of World War II. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The Japanese government did not react immediately as the level of damage had not yet been assessed. Less than 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, in violation of the 1941 Treaty of Neutrality, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. About 11 hours after that offensive began, a second American atomic bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered on August 15th, but the Soviet-Japanese conflict continued for several weeks. Why did Japan surrender? Was it strictly because of the Americans' use of the atomic weapons? Probably not. The Soviet declaration of war against Japan likely played an important part in the Japanese decision to surrender. Let's first consider the background of that conflict. In 1937 to 1938, in a series of border skirmishes known collectively as the Battles of Nomonhan, the Japanese were defeated by the Soviets. Though technically not a part of World War II, the battles foretold future events. The countries remained at peace until 1945. In April of 1941, the USSR and Japan signed a Treaty of Neutrality, in which they pledged not to attack each other. Neither wanted a war on multiple fronts. As World War II progressed, the Soviets decided that they wanted a piece of the post-war pie. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943 and again at the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin had committed the USSR to joining the struggle against Japan after the defeat of Germany. The Americans agreed to give the Soviets significant post-war possessions at the expense of Japan. With the war going badly for the Japanese, they sought Soviet assistance as a mediator. But on April 5th of 1945, Moscow informed Tokyo that it would not renew the neutrality treaty when it expired in April of 1946. Germany surrendered to the Western Allies on May 7th of 1945, and also to the Soviets shortly after on May 9th. In late July of 1945, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Harry S. Truman, who became president after Roosevelt's death, met at Potsdam outside Berlin. During the conference, Churchill was voted out of office and was replaced by his successor, Clement Attlee. The Americans and the British issued the Potsdam Declaration, which was in effect an ultimatum to the Japanese laying out the terms of Japanese capitulation. Stalin did not sign the declaration, nor was he asked to, as the USSR was not yet at war with Japan. The events of 1945 have been discussed. Let's turn to a discussion of the actual Soviet-Japanese conflict. As early as the Tehran Conference in November 1943, the USSR had pledged to declare war on Japan once Germany was defeated in Europe. The German capitulation came in May of 1945, and it was therefore just a matter of time before the USSR would formally join the fray in the Pacific. In fact, the stage had been set as far back as April, when the USSR informed Japan that it would not be renewing its previously discussed neutrality pact with the empire. The moment finally came at 11 p.m. on August 8, 1945, when the USSR formally announced that a state of war existed between itself and the Empire of Japan. Shortly after midnight the next day, August 9th, Soviet troops invaded Manchuria, and the final stage of the Pacific War drama was begun. The Soviet offensive in Manchuria was a classic pincer offensive that actually extended beyond the formal borders of Manchuria itself. The plan called for attacks on 3 fronts simultaneously: east, west, and north. Attacks from the north and east were perhaps to be expected, but the western pincer took the Japanese in Manchuria completely by surprise. This movement was confusing because it was far from resupply lines and thus completely unexpected. Furthermore, it was accompanied by Soviet airborne attacks on airfields and city centers, completely overwhelming the unprepared and disorganized Japanese forces. This widespread, diverse, and overwhelming show of force was too much for the Japanese, who had their attention focused on the American Pacific offensive. and had no troops to spare to counter this new Soviet threat. Once the atomic bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the end was inevitable, and the Japanese were forced to capitulate. Though the actual war fighting between Japan and the USSR began in 1945, there were a number of lessons that Japan could have learned prior to that date that could have prepared it better for the Soviet onslaught. Had it done so, perhaps the overwhelming superiority of the Soviet attack would not have been such a surprise. First, the Namenhan incident of 1939, part of the undeclared border war between the USSR and Japan, should have tipped off the Japanese that division-level battles with Soviet forces would not be easily won. They apparently did not take this lesson to heart. Second, the Japanese did not take the various intelligence warnings seriously that the Soviets were about to send massed troops and armor to Siberia. Better awareness could have led to better preparedness. Third, it was naive to assume that the Soviets had not learned valuable lessons while fighting the German panzers, lessons that would be put to good use in the declared war with Japan. Finally, the Kwantung Army was badly depleted and badly overwhelmed by Soviet forces, on the border of a ratio about 2-1. This should have prepared Japan for the worst and presaged a defeat, which it could nevertheless not envision. While much attention has been focused on the dropping of the atomic bombs as the immediate cause of the Japanese surrender, it was in fact the Soviet offensive in Manchuria that truly tipped the scales. The Empire of Japan had been holding on, losing ground but determined to fight to the bitter end against the American onslaught. However, once the Soviet-Japanese War began on another front, its will was broken, its resources, both material and human, exhausted, and its defeat preordained. While the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, one important piece of the war in the Pacific has never officially come to a close. The Soviet Union, now Russia, and Japan have never signed a peace treaty and therefore are technically still at war. The San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed by 48 countries with one notable exception, the Soviet Union. Implemented on April 28, 1952, the treaty deprived Japan of all of the territories it seized since 1895, including Taiwan, Korea, Southern Sakhalin, and subsidiary islands. In the legal sense, the peace treaty ended the state of war between Japan, and is notable for its relatively generous terms with regard to reparations and war guilt. What was the major sticking point in the negotiations between Japan and Russia? The Kuril Islands, which have been disputed territory between the two nations since the 19th century. Moscow regarded these islands as the southernmost part of the Kuril chain, which Japan had renounced at San Francisco. The treaty neither specified, however, which islands belonged to the Kuril chain, nor recognized Soviet control over them. Japan, backed up by the United States, argued that the 4 islands do not belong to the Kurils and that the USSR was illegally occupying them. The dispute over the islands is still very real and plays an active role in the geopolitics of the region to this day. In early 2019, Moscow and Tokyo returned to the negotiation table for a discussion about the islands. Tensions remain, as Moscow bristled at leaked stories from Tokyo that they were willing to return 2 of the islands to Japan. In fact, in a poll released in the fall of 2018, 74% of Russians opposed returning any of the islands to the Japanese. The close relationship between Japan and the United States, forged following the Treaty of San Francisco, plays an important role in the ongoing concerns in the region. Japan is cooperating on a new missile defense system, which is opposed by Russia, of course, and Russia seeks to weaken United States alliances and will likely insist that any transfer stipulate that no United States troops would be allowed to be stationed on those islands. Additionally, Japan has sanctions against Russia as a result of its annexation of Crimea. So Russia does have an interest in negotiating a deal with Japan to improve their relations. In addition to the Kuril Islands, the division of Korea between the United States and the Soviet Union along the 38th parallel has already sparked one major war and continues to be a source of ongoing tension. Each country has large numbers of troops stationed in the demilitarized zone, and as recently as August 4th of 2020, several unnamed countries believe that North Korea has engineered miniaturized nuclear devices for the warheads of its ballistic missiles, according to a report submitted by the UN Security Council. In fact, as of September 2, 2020, the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker stated, quote, North Korea is a nuclear power with a complex relationship with China, and preventing both an interstate Korean war and a North Korean internal collapse are critical United States national security interests. Along with continued weapons and missile tests, small-scale military and cyber provocations by North Korea pose significant risks, as each incident carries with it the potential for further and potentially uncontrollable escalation. Outright threats from North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un are also cause for concern, as he claims that North Korean weapons can now reach United States territories and even the United States mainland. End quote. As these continuing stories unfold, we see how 75 years later, the conflict between Japan and the USSR is still being played out on the world's political stage. As you browse through our list of sources with which our information was derived, we would like to thank you for joining us on a short tour through an obscure portion of World War II history. From everyone here at Fab 5 Productions, we will see you on the high ground.